Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for a look at Precision Digital's new PDK 9000-D1 USB data logging add-on feature for the ConsoliDator Plus. Before we get started here today, I'd like to just address a couple of questions that I often get in these webinars. They're by far the two most commonly asked questions. Is the webinar being recorded? And can I get a copy of the slides after the webinar is complete? And the answer to both questions is absolutely yes. We are doing a recording of today's webinar, and that recording will be made available to you around mid-next week by an email. That email will go to everyone who attended or even just signed up for today's webinar. And with that email, you'll also get a downloadable copy of the slides we're going to look at here today in PDF. So if we're thinking of sharing this with anyone, or even just reviewing it for your own benefit, we will definitely send you out everything you need to do that. I also want to address the fact that you have undoubtedly noticed you are all in listen-only mode. There are too many people on the line for us to have that many dogs barking, babies crying, etc. It would just be chaos on the phone lines. And so as a result, I do have you all on mute, but if you have a question during the presentation, please go ahead and type that question into the chat box in the lower left of your screen. It may be somewhere else if you're connected on a mobile device. And with that, bookkeeping out of the way, let's jump into today's webinar discussion by allowing me to introduce myself. So I am Joe Ryan. I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing with Precision Digital. I've been in this industry now for more than 15 years doing the design of some of these products, but also the marketing, manufacturing, and selling of them as well. That gives me a lot of exposure to field applications and in particular, of course, the ConsoliDator Plus, Precision Digital's new multi-channel controller that came out about 2 years ago. So I know a lot about the industry, the processes in it, but particularly Precision Digital's products, which is what we're here to talk about today. Before we get into the meat of our topic, perhaps you can share a little information with me, such as where you learned about this webinar. I'd love to know if you heard about it by our email campaign, if you happen to see it on our website, maybe you saw it promoted on LinkedIn, or some other location. If you heard about it from another location, do me a favor and, again, just type that other answer into your chat box for me. And it's looking like the vast majority of you got this by email, so it's great to hear that we're able to reach out and get in touch with you like that. And finally, how familiar are you with the ConsoliDator Plus? This will help me tailor our discussion here today a little bit. Are you already a ConsoliDator Plus product? Maybe you're familiar with it. You've seen some literature, considered selling one or buying one. Maybe you know very little about it. This might be your first in-depth exposure to it. Or you're wondering what the heck is a ConsoliDator Plus. And it looks like we don't have anyone who's an expert in the audience here today, but we do have some people who are familiar with it. In fact, the vast majority of you are. So we might do a slight overview on it. You'll see some perhaps about it after today's webinar. I'll be happy to talk with any of you here who say you know very little about it or are not too sure about what it even is. Just check later on, either in the post-meeting survey or in our last poll question here, that you want to learn more, and we'll be happy to reach out and talk with you about it. So let's go ahead and dive into our topic, shall we? What we're going to be talking about today is the PDK 9000-D1, which is the USB data logging add-on feature for the ConsoliDator Plus. Note again, this is an add-on feature, and I'll talk a little. We're going to learn how that gets installed on your ConsoliDator, whether it's being bought at the factory new or you're trying to get this add-on feature onto an already installed ConsoliDator Plus. We're going to take a look at how the setup of the data logging goes and what the capabilities of it are. And then I'm going to show you on the demo I have here on my desk what that actually looks like in practice. There's not a whole lot of hardware changes that happen when you get the data logging feature, but I think it'd be nice for you to see it and how it works. So for starters, the PDK 9000-D1 is an add-on feature for the ConsoliDator Plus. This means that you can buy it at the time you're buying any ConsoliDator Plus as an additional features package, or it means you can add it to any newly bought ConsoliDator Plus that's already installed in the field at a later date. It is a data logging feature, so what does that mean? Well, it allows the ConsoliDator Plus to data log to a USB flash drive. You're, I'm sure, all familiar with those USB flash drives and what they're basically like. Some people call them thumb drives, but essentially it's a small little drive that plugs into a standard USB port. You can create data logs that contain the same type of process data that you can display on the ConsoliDator Plus. So you actually build your data log and tell it what you want to be having in each log. Each one of the up to 8 logs that you can have can contain up to 12 process variables. And those could be your actual PV inputs, your milliamp input, pulse inputs, the status of your relay or 420 outputs, your timers, alarm statuses, the actual relay status, or any combination thereof. So whatever information you want to have in your data log, that's the information you can put in your data log. And you can also control the data log in various ways, which we're going to take a look at in a few slides. But basically what that does is let you trigger when a log happens. So how do you actually install this data logging feature? Well, there's really 2 ways to do it. You can get it when you buy your ConsoliDator Plus new from the factory, or you can field install it. If you buy it from the factory, then along with your ConsoliDator Plus part number, you order that PDK 9001-D1 part number. And if you do that, then we're going to go ahead and install this feature set at the factory. We're going to ship it out to you with the USB stick, and it'll be just one combined product, and you won't really even need to worry about it being a quote-unquote add-on feature. Now, if you buy it as a field installation, then what you're going to do is you're going to order that PDK 9000-D1 separately. We're going to give you a key that you then type into your ConsoliDator Plus that's based on the unique identifier number of your unit. And that's going to unlock the ability to use that data logging feature. Now, a few things to note about that. We will ship you out a USB drive when you order that after the fact, if you order it after your ConsoliDator is already shipped. Certainly not all USB drives are created equal, and some are better than others. We have a preferred USB drive that we use, which is a 32 gigabyte SanDisk USB drive. So even if you think you have a bunch, we'll send you out one to use for this. And it's also useful to note that this requires ConsoliDator Plus firmware version 2.2, which is a very recent release. So if you have a ConsoliDator Plus that's been in the field for a year, well, we can certainly get the data logging feature added to it. However, it's going to require it to come back to the factory for a refresh of the firmware. So certainly at this point forward, any ConsoliDator Plus units that are sold can have that USB feature added, but you have to be somewhat new to today's date in order to get this feature unlocked. So how do you set up the data log? Well, all the data logging setup is done on one screen. So here is your data log screen. In theory, there are actually 8 of these log screens you could have, because you could actually have 8 different data logs all being triggered on different events or logging at different intervals containing different information. But each one of those 8 data logs has a screen set up that looks very much like this. And this is what it looks like in the software that you use for setting up the ConsoliDator Plus, as well as if you were to use the front panel push buttons. Excuse me. And you've got your log number at the top, so you've got logs 1 through 8 over here. Then you give each one a name. You can add the items that you want to have in it. And then you've got these checkboxes with drop-downs or easy-to-enter menus here that set how that data log is going to work. And we're going to walk through each one of those so you really have an understanding for what the data log is capable of. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to add your items to be logged. So these are the up to 12 items that you want kept track of in that data log. And these could be your milliamp inputs, your digital inputs, perhaps Modbus inputs that either it's pulling and pulling in as a master or a client device, or that's being written to it as a slave device or a server. You can get your channels, your scaled engineering values, your totals, your timers, milliamp outputs, really anything you could want that a ConsoliDator Plus is going to do for you, you can have as one of your 12 selected items. Then you've got a selection for the start-stop. And again, you're going to notice that these are very easy to set up. And what I mean by that is if you want to have the start-stop feature that we're about to talk about enabled, all you have to do is check that checkbox. Or in reality, you'll note you put a little dot inside of the box. So these are not sort of esoteric things where you've just got like a parameter there, and then you got a 0 or a 1, and you got to choose what you do with it. No, these are checkboxes, drop downs, and easy to understand menus. That's one of the advantages of the Consolidator Plus. And so what specifically the start-stop function does is it allows you to give the operator or give the system the ability to start and stop the logging process. So if you don't have this checked, then logging is going to just be done automatically. It's going to log based off whatever you tell it to as far as the interval or the event at which it's logging. But if you want people to have the ability to start and stop the data log, great, you check that box, and now they can add it as a function key down the bottom of their consolidator. One of those keys on their screen could be start and stop the data log. You could start and stop it with digital inputs, Modbus inputs, Modbus outputs. You could even have a channel control it. So you could set up a schedule for it to run at specific times. Then you've got the setup log enable switch option where you could check that, and if you check that off, it's going to give you a couple of options for what you can have be that switch. You'll see here, for example, digital input 1 is our switch. And what that does is it says, great, we're going to log whenever this switch is on. So I could use, for example, a digital input, a switch on the panel, and whenever that switch is triggered, great, I'm going to start data logging. I could have that be a PLC digital output coming to our digital input. It could be that I only want it to start data logging when I'm in a certain alarm state, or annunciator channel is triggered, or one of my relays goes off. So there's different ways you can tell it, all right, I want you to only log in a case where I really care about the data log. I don't need it to just be logging 24/7. So if this trigger happens, then start your data log. Then you've got your log trigger, which sounds a little bit like what we just talked about, but it's slightly different in that the trigger makes one entry whenever that trigger occurs. So for example, I could have a digital input where someone walks up to my panel, pushes the button, and when they do that, it makes a log entry. It doesn't start the log to run forever like what we just discussed, so long as that switch is on, it logs. No, this is just an individual discrete point where this thing happened, and now I'm going to log. So if I wanted to log every time a specific alarm goes off or every time a relay triggers, I can do that. If I wanted to log every time I get a signal from a PLC, I can do that. And it'll just take the single log. The most common way, of course, people log is that they just log by time. They wanted to make a log entry every so many minutes, hours, days, seconds. So you can set that log interval up from 1 second to just about 100 hours. And every time that time gets elapsed, it's going to make a log entry. So if I really want to know what's going on with this process, I can set it up to log every second. More likely, I'm only going to be interested in this log every 24 hours or maybe once a week. And this is another interesting point for me to remind you that you get those 8 different data logs, right? So I could have some really critical data coming in here. I've got tanks, for example, that are being filled and unfilled all day, every day. And let's say every hour I want to take a reading on those just so I know where they stand. But then I've also got some flow meter totals that maybe I only care about once a day. And so I could set one data log up to log every hour, and I could have my tank information in that. But then I could also set a data log up to run every 24 hours and have that second data log only contain my totalizers. So one more advantage of being able to have those 8 different configured logs. And what does a data log actually look like? Well, this is a sample data log file for you. You can have a maximum of 8 individual logs, as we discussed, and each log can have 12 variables. So in reality, I can have 96 variables being measured at any given time. These are logged as a CSV file, or a comma-separated value file, which is a file type that, for example, Excel is going to just recognize. You can open it right into Excel. However, it's program agnostic. It is not an Excel file by default. If you prefer some other program, that's great. You can certainly bring it into those. Each individual one of those 8 data logs is going to have a maximum of 100 megabytes, which is a lot of data. I can tell you that you're not going to have an issue with this creating a new file every couple of hours because you're logging. So that's That is days of data in most applications. It's not months. 100 megabytes for a simple log like this is larger than you're probably even going to need. But even if you do hit that 100 megabytes, all it's going to do is just create a new file. And in case your oldest log data really is valuable, there is the ability to stop when full so that you don't overwrite any logs. Now, I say stop when full, but let's take a brief moment and just talk about what being full actually means. When we send you a USB stick, or when you get it with your ConsoliDator Plus because you bought it at the same time as your ConsoliDator Plus, you get a 32 gigabyte USB stick. Now, to give you some perspective on that, and these numbers are going to be a little big, so this is a good time to kind of pay attention and follow along with me. To give you a sense of the numbers we're actually talking about here, if you were to have, let's say, quote-unquote, average data logging application, where you were going to have 4 different data logs, and so you're not maxing it out. And let's say you're also only going to do 8 variables apiece, right? So certainly I could do 12 variables in 8 logs. But let's just say for a minute that I've only got 4 logs, and I'm logging 8 variables into each one of those, right? If I do that, then because I have a 32 gigabyte drive that I'm using for this data log, that's going to give me 160 million records that I can log. 160 million. Well, what does 160 million records look like? Well, if I'm taking a log every minute, that means I'm going to get 60 years worth of time. Heck, if I'm maxing out my data log, and I have all 8 data logs running, each one of them has 12 variables apiece, each one of them has a 1-minute log time, I still have 16 years worth of records that I can store in this. So one of the questions I know is going to get raised, in fact, looking at the questions, it looks like it already has come up, is that how many data logs can I store here? And the answer is more than you will ever need. It's really the answer. But if somebody needs a number, you're talking that you've at least got 16 years worth of data log capability. So at this point, why don't I stop for a minute and show you what the data log actually looks like. And by that I mean take a look at what the real hardware looks like that you're getting on your ConsoliDator Plus when you get this feature. So I'm going to set up the ConsoliDator Plus that's here on my desk, if you'll bear with me here for one moment, and show you what that looks like. All right, now I'm going to share my screen. Thank you for bearing with me here during that pause. Oh, and actually what just popped up is actually the instruction manual I was just looking at to confirm those numbers. So you can see here that here is my number of logs that I can record, and let me point that out. Here's the number of logs that I can record. Somewhere in here. There we go. There's my number of records. And here's my examples for how many records I can store for each one of those examples. So that 32 gigabyte flash drive is going to have way more than you're actually going to require on it. And with that, let me pop open my camera share here. All right. So here is a quote-unquote standard screen for the ConsoliDator Plus. On it, I've got tank levels 1 through 4 as my screen name. I'm using it to show my 4 tanks. And tanks 1 and 2 are water, tanks 3 and 4 are oil. Each one of those has a nice, easy-to-read number on it, color-coded to the bar graph that it's associated with. And you've got commas and decimals in there that you can easily see from distance. At the bottom, I've got my 5 soft keys that I can program to do whatever I want for this screen. And so to data log this information, if I actually open up that file, it looks something like this. And so what you can see here is I've got my title for the data log. So in this case, I've named it tanks 1 through 4 log. Very creative, I know. Same thing with my consolidator tag, very creative, multivariable controller. And then I've got my time and date stamp. And I've got each one of my 4 tanks being data logged with their units. so I happen to know that they're all gallons. Now I'm also choosing to log the alarms associated with those. So I've got my alarm 1, tank 1 high alarm, and the units, which are just on off because it's an alarm. But that's going to give me the information as far as what the state was of all of my alarms at that time. So there's my tank 1 high. You'll notice, by the way, I opened this in Excel because a CSV file opens in Excel very easily. And there's the rest of my alarms. I've got a high and a low alarm set up for every one of my tanks. So there's my 12 variables that I've got logging into this. If I wanted to set up the log manually and not use the computer software setup, I'd go here to my setup. I'd scroll down to my data logs. And you can see here I've got 2 logs going, one for my tank level and one for my totalizers. And if I go into my tank 1 through 4 log, there's my setup. It looks exactly like the screen I showed you earlier, which is how it appears in the setup software. So here are my individual data log contents. So I just added those added those variables in there, my 4 channels plus my alarms. You know, those checkboxes for each one of those data logging settings that we talked about. If I wanted to edit, I just click edit. And for example, if I want to remove one of these from my data log, there we go. I can just take tank 4's low alarm and edit it, change it, move it in the location in the data log, whatever I'd like to do. If I wanted to add something else in, great. I just say I'm done. I go add something else. I've got a whole lot of capabilities programmed up in this demo unit here. So, I don't know, let's go add this tank 1 alarm horn, which is an alarm to run my horn and light attached to this ConsoliDator demo. So I add that in there and done. I click done, and now I've changed what the data log is doing. Hardware-wise, how does that whole USB stick element play into this? Well, let's take a look, shall we? Flip this around. So on the back of my ConsoliDator Plus, I have all of my I/O cards. That's what you see over here. And then I've got my standard features plus 2 optional features, my Ethernet port, which allows it to have Modbus TCP/IP. And the other optional feature here is my USB host with the USB drive in it. So when you get the data logging feature, this is the port that will activate for you, this full-size USB port. The micro USB port is a standard feature that is always there on the ConsoliDator Plus. It's what you use to connect up to the software. So you don't obviously use the micro USB port for your USB stick. You use that USB host, and you don't use the USB host connection to plug in to use the software, which is why it's actually not present on most ConsoliDator Pluses. If you don't get the USB data logging feature, this USB host port is covered up. It's not present for you. And so all I have in that is this tiny 32 gigabyte USB drive. And what is great about this specific 32 gigabyte SanDisk USB drive is it is very low profile. When it is in the ConsoliDator, it comes out less than the width of my fingernail. These depluggable connectors actually poke out further from the bed. And what we found during our own testing is that's a great feature, and one of the reasons we recommend this specific drive, because it means that your USB drive is not going to get banged around. If you put your standard USB drive in there that's a couple of inches long, and you have that sticking out from the back of your panel, it's going to get hit by wires, it's going to get hit by people's arms and elbows when they're working on this panel, and you run the risk of it being pulled out, having it get dropped and lost, having it be jerked free, or even potentially damage the drive. And so using a small, low-profile drive lets it stay nice and flush against the back of the ConsoliDator so that in the panel it doesn't risk being jostled, damaged, or disconnected in any way. Another nice feature of that drive is that when I take it in and out of the ConsoliDator Plus, like I just did, if I come out here and I pull this drive, well, obviously it has stopped data logging onto the drive. However, the minute I plug it back in, it's going to start data logging again. So if I've got it set up for interval logging, which I do, where I'm just taking a reading every few minutes or seconds or hours, it's just going to pick right back up again. I don't have to go in and confirm anything. I don't have to tell it that I put the drive back in. So you don't run the risk that someone's going to want some data off of it, pull it out, bring it back, plug it in, and then forget to re-enable it, and all of a sudden you're no longer data logging. That is not going to happen. It's just going to pick back up with the data log. It will, however, make a new file every time I plug it in, or pull it out and plug it back in again. So in that data log folder for data log 1, it's going to create a new CSV file every time you plug it back in, which is a great feature because it adds the ability to see when your data log USB stick was removed. Now I'm going to see that there's a break there because somebody unplugged this, and I can compare my data, figure out what the story is, and if there was a critical data point that happened in that window, I'm going to know that, well, I didn't capture it because somebody unplugged the drive from the back of the ConsoliDator. So hardware-wise, it's very simple. You've just got that one USB drive that gets added, and then you just set up your data logs to the front of the ConsoliDator Plus, or preferably in the software. That's my preferred method of doing it. So with that, I have one more question for you, which is, would you like to be contacted by someone from Precision Digital in order to take a look at a ConsoliDator Plus demo unit? Maybe you just want to see the data logging feature for yourself, or maybe you'd really like to spend more time with you, either on a video call in person or with the demo unit yourself, so that you could get to know the ConsoliDator Plus a little better. I know there were many of you earlier that said you were not experts. Unfortunately, going through the ConsoliDator is a longer exercise than we could do here today. But getting a demo in front of you one way or another is a great way to do that. You saw, as we were just briefly looking at the USB feature, that the demos get all kinds of inputs and outputs and pre-configured settings on it that really give you a sense for the power of this unit. And so I thank you folks there who have clicked yes. We'll be sure to be in touch. With that, I thank everyone for attending. I'm going to field a few questions now. But before anyone goes, I will ask that should a survey pop up at the end of this webinar, you take a moment to fill it out. It's how we know how we're doing on these webinars. It's how we get new webinar ideas. And so if you could just take a brief moment, fill out the 3 or 4 questions that are there, I certainly would appreciate it. Most of them are just yes, no. And now let me see if I can answer a couple of questions from those of you in the audience. So the first question comes from Kirk, who's asking if there's any way to data log directly onto a computer as opposed to onto the USB drive. Great question, Kirk. I know it is a USB connection here that we're using, but it does need to data log directly onto the USB drive. So you can't just, for example, plug a USB cord into that port and run it to your computer and data log. If that's what you want to do, we certainly have plenty of products that will do that at Precision Digital. Our ProView panel meters, our Trident panel meters all have what's called MeterView software and MeterView Pro that will let you data log directly onto your PC on a file rather than onto the unit or onto a USB stick. So we have units that will do that. If that's something you need, we can certainly help you out. It just doesn't happen to be the ConsoliDator. Khalid has asked, do we lose data being logged while the USB drive has been removed? Unfortunately, you do. If you don't have the USB drive in, then the data log has nowhere to record that data. And so the drive has to be installed for you to capture that data. I've also got a question here from Thomas. Thomas is wondering, do we need to eject the USB drive safely like you would if you were plugging it in your computer? Well, that's a great question. The true answer is, how should I put this? You should. You can go into the data log menu and safely eject the drive. You just go into the settings of the meter and you go down to your data log menus and you click Safe Eject. I will tell you, I don't do it. I know most of you probably don't. You know, much like on a PC when you're plugging and unplugging the USB drives, I think very few people in the audience actually safely remove that drive. So while we have the setting to do it and it's recommended, realistically most people probably aren't. And we've got lots of code in this unit to try to prevent any data loss that might happen, or any data corruption that might happen from just unplugging it. So certainly I recommend that you do a safe eject when you remove the USB drive, but if you don't, you're probably going to be okay. Sam has asked, can you log in intervals less than 1 second? For example, he says he's got surge pressures in a force main that he'd like to log, and it just takes more than 1 second worth of data logging. Unfortunately, you cannot do that. 1 second is really the fastest that you can log here. In fact, generally, if you need something that's going to have fractions of a second where it's going to read that information, and then probably if you're controlling something in that main, you're going to want to trigger relays and such based on tens of milliseconds, then this probably is not the product for that kind of an application. It does work great for pressure applications, just not ones where you need fractions of a second reaction time to shut things off, which I do know some people run into in pressure applications. And Frank has a good question here. Any plans to have a graphical display history option on the ConsoliDator Plus itself? And of course, when you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is a chart recorder. Are there any plans to have chart recorder-like features on here where you could see a trend line, you could see some past graphs of what a channel may have done? And it's a great idea. It's certainly on the potential enhancements list. If it does happen, I don't think you're going to see it for a while. So you're talking a year plus, just because it's not in the short-term to-do list, I don't think, for things that will be coming out. Now, I'll let you know, within the month or so, you're probably going to hear some things about, for example, Class 1 Div 2 ConsoliDator Pluses, which is great. I can't wait for this to have UL and CUL hazardous area approvals. You'll see that coming shortly. So there are things we're working on to continuously improve the product, but chart recording capabilities, kind of a historic trend graph, unfortunately that is just not one of the short-term things that we're going to be working on. There are a few more questions in here. Some of them are just too complicated for me to address in the webinar itself, so we'll have to get back to a few of you here after the webinar, which we'll definitely do. And I wanted to thank everybody for giving me your time. You've given me more than half an hour, which I know is valuable, so I thank you for that. I hope it has been a helpful webinar and giving you some interesting ideas about how you can use the ConsoliDator Plus. Please fill out that survey if you happen to see it when you leave. Otherwise, contact me with any questions, application, or otherwise that you may have. I thank you very much, and I wish you all a good rest of your week. Thanks.